Okay, everyone. Well, this is a first test of Zoom from church. And so you guys on Zoom out there, if you can't hear something or whatever, then, kind of let us know how things are going. I think that you all can hear audio fairly well. Because we're going to be trying to go through a couple of chapters of Daniel today, if we can. We'll see how that goes, though. You never know.
Live from Studio One at Bonnier Christian Church. Live on tape.
So do we have everyone there? Gail's there, Nancy's there.
Yep. Sound is coming in great.
Okay, those of you who were with us last week, do you remember what happened? Not last week, but the week before. When we last left Daniel, we were at the end of chapter 4.
Nebuchadnezzar praised God.
Right.
He changed his tune.
Okay.
After all of his self-centeredness, then he was like, woohoo, there's some good things happening here because of God.
Yeah. Right. And the last couple of verses read in chapter 4. At that time, my reason returned to me. He had actually after a period, he lifted his eyes up to heaven, and his reason returned to him. And at that time, my reason returned to me, and my majesty and splendor were restored to me for the glory of my kingdom. My counselors and my Lord sought me out. And so he regained his power and ruled happily forever after. Right? Well, when we get ready to start chapter 5, we are going to jump quite a bit ahead in history here. But before we read it, I wanted to, just kind of go over this a little bit, that with a lot of times going to be passing between chapter 4 and chapter 5, Nebuchadnezzar has been restored to power when he finally praises God as the King of Heaven. And then the new chapter is going to begin with King Belshazzar. And they describe King Belshazzar as the son of Nebuchadnezzar. But actually, a quarter of a century goes by between Nebuchadnezzar and Belshazzar. And I took a look in Wikipedia and on the web and just looked at the history and what happened between Nebuchadnezzar and Belshazzar. And Nebuchadnezzar, it was in 562 BCE when Nebuchadnezzar, at the end of Nebuchadnezzar's reign. And then there was for 2 additional years until 560, a king Marduk, who was actually Nebuchadnezzar's actual physical son, was in charge, but that was only for 2 years. And if we remember early on in Daniel, when they talked about the statue that Nebuchadnezzar had dreamed of, and the head was gold, and then it got a little bit lesser and lesser in the kingdom as you went down the body until it was clay and iron in the feet. This is kind of what is happening here. We have Nebuchadnezzar was returned to glory through his belief in God. And then we have his son, who was only there for 2 years. And then we have another king, Nerigelsar, who was there for 4 years. And then for about 1 month, another king was there. And then we have King Nabonidus. Okay, and it says that he was there until 539. And do you know what happened in 539?
I'm not good at dates.
The overthrow of Babylon by the Persians.
That's right. Right. It was Babylon was overthrown.
Oh, okay.
So where is Belshazzar in all of this?
True.
So Belshazzar was the entrusted eldest son of Nabonidus. Okay, and apparently this king, he entrusted his kingdom to Belshazzar, and he left Babylon and went to an oasis in the middle of the Arabian desert. And he stayed there for a decade. And so Belshazzar was never really officially king. He was the eldest son, and he was taking the place of the king, but he never participated in any of the religious festivals that the king should do and various things like that. So he was kind of all power and fun and party, kind of a thing. And so we'll see as we begin this story that this is where we join with Belshazzar, and it calls him King Belshazzar in Daniel. And so what I want to do is try to divide up the reading of Daniel 5 into two pieces, from 1 to 16. And I can read that, or if one of you would like to read it.
Tommy, you want to read
You
one?
Since
preserve
you're
your,
Sarah.
you preserve your voice, yes. I'll be Sarah today.
Okay, and okay, so go through 16, and then
17 through 30.
you want to do 17 through 30? Okay,
Sure.
Whatever.
okay, we'll let you read 6.
Oh,
No, we'll let him read in chapter 6.
Okay. All right,
If we-
duties have been assigned.
Okay,
King Belshazzar made a great festival for 1,000 of his lords, and he was drinking wine in the presence of the 1,000. Under the influence of the wine, Belshazzar commanded that they bring in the vessels of gold and silver that his father Nebuchadnezzar had taken out of the temple in Jerusalem, so that the king and his lords, his wives, and his concubines might drink from them. So they brought in the vessels of gold and silver that had been taken out of the temple, the house of God in Jerusalem, and the king and his lords, his wives, and his concubines drank from them. They drank the wine and praised the gods of gold and silver, bronze, iron, wood, and stone. Verse 5. Immediately, the fingers of a human hand appeared and began writing on the plaster of the wall of the royal palace next to the lampstand. The king was watching the hand as it wrote. Then the king's face turned pale, and his thoughts terrified him. His limbs gave way and his knees knocked together. The king cried aloud to bring in the enchanters, the Chaldeans, and the diviners. And the king said to the wise men of Babylon, whoever can read this writing and tell me its interpretation shall be clothed in purple and have a chain of gold around his neck and rank third in the kingdom. Then all the king's wise men came in, but they could not read the writing or tell the king the interpretation. Then King Belshazzar became greatly terrified, and his face turned pale, and his lords were perplexed. The queen, when she heard the discussion of the king and his lords, came into the banqueting hall. The queen said, "O king, live forever. Do not let your thoughts terrify you or your face grow pale. There is a man in your kingdom who is endowed with the spirit of the holy gods. In the days of your father, he was found to have enlightenment, understanding, and wisdom, like the wisdom of the gods. Your father, King Nebuchadnezzar, made him chief of the magicians, enchanters, Chaldeans, and diviners, because an excellent spirit, knowledge, and understanding to interpret dreams, explain riddles, and solve problems were found in this Daniel, whom the king named Belshazzar. Now let Daniel be called, and he will give the interpretation." Then Daniel was brought in before the king. The king said to Daniel, "So you are Daniel, one of the exiles of Judah, whom my father the king brought from Judah. I have heard of you, that a spirit of the gods is in you, and that enlightenment, understanding, and excellent wisdom is found in you. Now the wise men, the enchanters, have been brought in before me to read this writing and tell me its interpretation, but they were not able to give the interpretation of the matter. But I have heard that you can give the interpretation and solve problems. Now, if you are able to read the writing and tell me its interpretation, you shall be clothed in purple, have a chain of gold around your neck, and rank third in the kingdom.
Then Daniel answered in the presence of the king, let your gifts be for yourself, or give your rewards to someone else. Nevertheless, I will read the writing to the king and let you know the interpretation. O king, the Most High God gave your father Nebuchadnezzar kingship, greatness, glory, and majesty. And because of the greatness that he gave him, all peoples, nations, and language trembled and feared before him. He killed those he wanted to kill, kept alive those he wanted to keep alive, honored those he wanted to honor, and degraded those he wanted to degrade. But when his heart was lifted up and his spirit was hardened so that he acted proudly, he was deposed from his kingly throne and his glory was stripped from him. He was driven from human society, and his mind was made like that of an animal. His dwelling was with the wild asses. He was fed grass like oxen, and his body was bathed with the dew of heaven, until he learned that the Most High God was sovereignty over the kingdom of mortals and sets over it whomever he will. And you, Belshazzar, his son, have not humbled your heart, even though you knew all this. You have exalted yourself before the Lord of heaven. The vessels of his temple have been brought in before you, and you and your lords, your wives, and your concubines have been drinking wine from them. You have praised the gods of silver and gold, of bronze, iron, wood, and stone, which do not see or hear or know. But the God in whose power is your every breath, and to whom among all your ways you have not honored. So from his presence the hand was sent, and this writing was inscribed, and this is the writing that was inscribed. Mene, Mene, Texel, and Parson. This is the interpretation of the matter. Mene, God has numbered the days of your kingdom and brought it to an end. Texel, Tekel, you have been weighed on the scales and found wanting. And Perez, your kingdom is divided and given to the Medes and the Persians. Then Belshazzar gave the command, and Daniel was clothed in purple. A chain of gold was put around his neck, and a proclamation was made concerning him that he should rank third in the kingdom. That very night, Belshazzar, the Chaldean king, was killed. And Darius, the Mede, received the kingdom, being about 62 years old.
So one of the things in the line of history we were just going through before the reading is that there are records that the Persians were prepared to come in and take over Babylon. And apparently Belshazzar's dad, who was away in the desert, was aware of this thing coming to be. And so he was actually going to be coming back and trying to, defend the city. And that apparently he had alienated being away for so long. He tried to come back and hold belated parties for all of these religious ceremonies that he was supposed to have participated in, and no one was buying it. They didn't trust him anymore. And basically Belshazzar was having apparently a big festival, a big party, which was, if in the readings you can tell, a little kind of scrupulous things were going on in this party. He brought out the vessels from the temple, to have people drink out of at this orgy party kind of a thing. And really that was the ultimate sacrilege, okay, that he was committing here. So he didn't learn anything from the stories of Nebuchadnezzar. and what Nebuchadnezzar had gone through with being out of his mind and away from his kingdom for so long. And apparently in recorded history, the Persians actually came in while all this partying was going on, dug a trench, diverted the Euphrates so that they could cross the riverbed and enter the royal castle area. And there is actually something on records that states that the Persians went to the palace, killed the drunken guards and the king, who is not named in history, but is simply described as a reckless and godless youngster. Okay. And so that was the fall of Babylon. They mentioned, if you remember, they mentioned Darius of the Mede or whatever. And one source says that the Medes were, not even in existence any longer.
Oh, okay.
So it was the Medes must have been, somehow, regarded as a part of this particular story, but they're not sure how that became a part of this story. So of course, we get kind of a instant replay of chapter 4 here in chapter 5, because he does go into detail of describing what had happened to Nebuchadnezzar. But apparently Belshazzar didn't really learn anything, or he didn't even know Daniel.
He didn't
seem to know Daniel. And another thing that the commentator had said was that they think that the queen, when they mention the queen, they're calling him King Belshazzar, but they think the queen was probably the queen mother. She sounds more like a mother, because the queen might not have, Belshazzar was in partying. The queen was not a part of any of that. She came in when she heard what was going on and said, hey, you might want to call Daniel and have him come and do this. But I don't know if you might be able to take this picture, but this is Rembrandt did a painting of Belshazzar's, the handwriting on the wall. And I really like that. We have so many things from the Bible that we use every day. Can't you read the handwriting on the wall? But you take this up and we can, show, this is an interpretation of Rembrandt's painting of the hand of God.
Very hard color.
There it goes.
And Rembrandt had apparently even been in touch with some of the Jewish community and the rabbis, because he was actually in the description, the reason that they couldn't read some of the people might not have been able to read what the inscription was that it was written backwards from what it normally would be. And so that's the way that Rembrandt depicts it in the painting with some advice from his Jewish friends, before he painted this.
It's interesting. Da Vinci wrote backwards too.
Yeah.
Is it Hebrews? Harold, isn't Hebrew read from the right to the left?
Yes.
Yeah, and so
Bottom to top.
so it was written completely opposite of what it should be. So it was left to right, whatever.
Okay.
So the handwriting was on the wall, and I know in our book they go into a lot of discussion about the lampstand, and because it says that suddenly the fingers of a human hand appeared on the plaster wall near the lampstand, and it sounds like that only the king was actually seeing the hand write on the wall. And do you remember in the last story that only Nebuchadnezzar saw the angels in the fiery furnace? But that everyone was able to see the actual result, the actual written inscription, because you had him again, just like Nebuchadnezzar did. He brought in everybody but Daniel, to start with, to have him try to interpret it. And of course, they were unsuccessful. And then the queen finally, who apparently they think was the queen mother, who was the actual wife of the king and knew the history and knew what had happened with Nebuchadnezzar and knew Daniel, called Daniel, told him, you better get Daniel in here to take a look at this. And so Daniel does come in. And one thing was this kind of funny was when they talked about how terrified the king was when he was watching this, and that it says that his knees became weak and his knees were knocking. And I think that they had said that in one interpretation, it says the knots of his hips loosened. Okay. And that means that he either collapsed or he lost control of his bowels.
He was that scared.
So he was a little frightened.
Wonder if this is where the term knock-kneed comes from.
Not me.
In our
Knock-kneed.
modern vernacular. It was knock-kneed.
Knock-kneed. And it seem like that we're hearing the same story, just a different version of it over and over.
I always thought of this as like
Daniel.
someone's term paper that had to be a minimum number of words and pages long. And they're just repeating everything he can to get to that minimum words.
That's true, because it just constantly repeats. And we had that early in Daniel when he was constantly repeating about the information about the statue that was being built and what it was made of and who was, and all of the people that were being called together to worship it and that type of thing.
So a very different style of writing than the synoptic gospels.
Right.
Especially Mark.
Right. And one reason that we're trying to read these chapters as instead of going kind of verse by verse like we do, and we know that we do in the New Testament, is that these are stories, and you almost have to read the story, to get it, rather than trying to analyze it piece by piece. So it says no one could read the message. It was written backwards or vertically, or abbreviations were used. And apparently these words were common weights. Okay, like it was talking about what is a shackle, or that a mean is a certain weight that's used, a monetary weight. But they were saying that what Daniel was doing when he was interpreting it was that he was taking nouns and then changing them to verbs, to come up with this interpretation of you have been, let's see how did he say it?
God has numbered the
Yes,
days.
right.
You have been
Weighed and found wanting, and your kingdom is divided
and given.
and given.
Oh.
Okay.
Okay.
Right. And so I was trying to see in my notes here, because I know that I had the actual, right here it is, that mean can also mean counted. And some people think that it said mean twice, and they think that might have been an error in the scribe or whatever, or that mean can be counted as a verb means counted. And that a mina, which they think is what mean was, is a Jewish talent. A mina is 60 shekels. And he reinterpreted it as numbered. Daniel says that it means that God has numbered the days of Belshazzar's kingdom. And then the tekel is the Aramaic equivalent of the Hebrew half minas, which is a half piece or 30 shekels. And that represents the kingdom that's partly iron and partly clay. This word shekel or tekel derived the root meaning to weigh, to interpret to the meaning that Belshazzar has been weighed and found deficient. And then the parson again, parson's final position, it said, explain not in terms of its value, but because of the wordplay. with the term Persians, the people who would bring down the empire. The plural word half pieces is interpreted as Paris. And you see when he says mean, tekel, parson, then when Daniel is actually interpreted, he calls it mean, tekel, and Paris, P-E-R-E-S, not parson. And Paris, which is taken to its root, means to divide, meaning the kingdom will be divided. And all of this story, all of this chapter happens in one night. Okay, we have the party, the handwriting on the wall, the interpretation by Daniel, and Babylon's gone. Okay, the Persians come and take over, you know, in one evening. So have we learned any different lesson from this story than we've learned from the two previous stories that we have with the fiery furnace? And
Well, Belshazzar didn't verbalize his appreciation to Daniel like Nebuchadnezzar
Right.
did. I mean, he gave him what he said he was going to give him.
he didn't
But it's not
apologize.
reported in here that he,
Yeah,
didn't.
he rewards Daniel. He starts out by saying, I'm going to give you a gold necklace. I'm going to put purple robes on you or whatever. But then Daniel says, no, you don't owe me, I don't want any of that. But Daniel was basically saying, you can't pay me to say what you want me to say. I'm going to say what the real interpretation, I'm going to tell you what I get from God. But with Belshazzar, there is absolutely no repentance, here. And he's killed that very night.
Well,
And why do you
was
think
no-
they actually, go ahead.
There was no acknowledgement on the king's part that Daniel's God was a powerful God. The others acknowledged that, and they didn't give all the glory to Daniel, but to Daniel's God.
Yeah, right,
Mhm.
right. And remember that we're now in the very end. So this is the very feet of the statue that was in chapter 1, where it's the feet of clay and iron. So this is the weakest of the kingdom, and like it said earlier, that this was a reckless youngster, that was actually in charge there.
Right, because Daniel had even gone through, and reminded him about Nebuchadnezzar.
Yeah,
and his
Nebuchadnezzar.
behavior and what happened to him and all
Right.
that.
And that because Nebuchadnezzar recognized in the end, he came back to his senses and recognized, hey, Bernie. Bernie's in the woods. Can you hear us?
Yeah, I think I'm gonna have to move from outside to inside because of my signal. So if I leave you, it's because you're breaking up.
Okay.
But as Arnie would say, I'll be back.
I'll be back. And why do you think it was important, or was it really important, that at the very end of this, it says Darius the Medes received the kingdom being about 62 years old?
Well,
It
the
struck me as
number
one
of
of
the
those-
shekels and the money came out to 62 also.
That's right. There's a lot of wordplay
Ah,
going on in here.
And it sounds like the development of the metric system to me.
Some of the other
Yeah.
things I found interesting as, going through this, the whole idea of, father, son, which wasn't the real son of, Nebuchadnezzar, and, and just that whole kind of tradition that if you were of the same mindset or the same maybe job or, same group, that you could be the son of someone previously as a father. And I got thinking about two things. We still do that today in America. you know, we have founding fathers. And we have the
Right.
sons of liberty, you know. And then the other
Daughters
thing-
of the American Revolution.
Right, yeah, exactly. So, and then the other thing that came to mind was, you know, these, the whole Aramaic language was brought back from Babylon when the, you know, Hebrews came back to Israel. And so it stands to reason a lot of the traditions were also inherited and brought back. And, you know, there are a lot of people that just pull their hair out trying to get Jesus's actual lineage to King David. But it also came to mind that maybe this tradition of being of the same group or the same mindset or same greatness, maybe, you know, the Hebrew now tradition of how Jesus goes back to David. You know, if you think about this
Right,
tradition.
right.
So,
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up, Harold, because they did go into a lot of discussion in the book about the father and son and how, you know, that, you know, the fathers are not just your biological father. Goes back in history to the founders, you know, so that's, you know, that was discussed quite a bit. Any other thoughts about this story?
well, one more thing, you know, in the children's Sunday school literature and, you know, well, probably in our thoughts too. Now I'm jumping ahead, but only a very short amount of time. Daniel's always drawn to be a young man, you know, when he's thrown in the lion's den and, you know, during his time period. Daniel's got to be in his early to mid 60s by now. So
Oh, yeah.
that kind of sheds a little different picture of what's going on, realizing Daniel is, by my math, is between 61 and 65 by this point.
Right. And as we begin the next chapter, where Daniel comes back into play again, we have him at, and this is after Babylon has been conquered. We have it with the Persian Empire with Darius, and it mentioned that he was probably around 75 years old when this was happening. Okay. If any other comments of this, we'll get started with chapter 6.
Well, one thing too, Darius, they have a hard time finding Darius in actual history. So it may have been just a title, kingship title. It was probably Cyrus that came in versus someone named Darius. They can't find Darius.
Yeah, Darius is not part of this history. It went straight from when I took a look at the history, actually, it went to Cyrus of Persia from there. But they're thinking that Darius may have been in some way, there was someone that came in that was like the chief guy who came in and led the battle to take over Babylon, was kind of put in charge, and that they might have given him some kind of a name associated with that. And that's where they're thinking that there was it might have been confused with a Darius, a Persian who was never really identified as a Mede, who reigned, but that person reigned after Cyrus. So let's get started on this next, and let's see if I can get it's 28. So we'll go through, like, if you want to go through 15, but right over here. So we're going to start chapter 6. This is the story the only story I knew really about Daniel. And he's 75.
I keep thinking about that handwriting on the wall, and isn't that part of the monsters, the hand?
Oh, thing.
The thing,
Is it
okay.
thing?
All right, Daniel in the lion's pit. It pleased Darius to set over the kingdom 120 satraps stationed throughout the whole kingdom, and over them 3 presidents, including Daniel. To these, the satraps gave account so that the king might suffer no loss. Soon Daniel disguised himself above all the other,
Distinguished.
Soon Daniel distinguished himself above all the other presidents and satraps because an excellent spirit was in him, and the king planned to appoint him over the whole kingdom. So the presidents and the satraps tried to find grounds for complaint against Daniel in connection with the kingdom, but they could find no grounds for complaint or any corruption, because he was faithful, and no negligence or corruption could be found in him. The men said, "We shall not find any ground for complaint against Daniel, unless we find it in connection with the law of his God." So the presidents and satraps conspired and came to the king and said to him, "O King Darius, live forever. All the presidents of the kingdom, the prefects and the satraps, the counselors and the governors are agreed that the king should establish an ordinance and enforce an interdict that whoever prays to anyone, divine or human, for 30 days, except to you, O king, shall be thrown into a den of lions. Now, O king, establish the interdict and sign the document so that it cannot be changed according to the law of the Medes and the Persians, which cannot be revoked. Therefore, King Darius signed the document and interdict. Although Daniel knew that the document had been signed, he continued to go to his house, which had windows in its upper room open toward Jerusalem, and to get down on his knees 3 times a day to pray to his God and praise him, just as he had done previously. The conspirators came and found Daniel praying and seeking mercy before his God. Then they approached the king and said concerning the interdict, "O king, did you not sign an interdict that anyone who prays to anyone divine or human within 30 days, except to you, O king, shall be thrown into a den of lions?" The king answered, "The thing stands fast, according to the new law, the Medes and the Persians, which cannot be revoked." Then they responded to the king, "Daniel, one of the exiles from Judah, pays no attention to you, O king, or to the interdict you have signed, but he is saying his prayers 3 times a day." When the king heard the charge, he was very much distressed. He was determined to save Daniel, and until the sun went down, he made every effort to rescue him. Then the conspirators came to the king and said to him, "Know, O king, that it is the law of the Medes and the Persians that no interdict or ordinance that the king establishes can be changed."
Then the king gave the command, and Daniel was brought and thrown into the den of lions. The king said to Daniel, "May your God, whom you faithfully serve, deliver you." A stone was brought and laid on the mouth of the den, and the king sealed it with his own signet and with the signet of his lords, so that nothing might be changed concerning Daniel. Then the king went to his palace and spent the night fasting. No food was brought to him, and sleep fled from him. Then at the break of day, the king got up and hurried to the den of lions. When he came near the den where Daniel was, he cried out anxiously to Daniel, "O Daniel, servant of the living God, has your God, whom you faithfully serve, been able to deliver you from the lions?" Daniel then said to the king, "O king, live forever. My God sent his angel and shut the lions' mouths so that they would not hurt me, because I was found blameless before him, and also before you, O king. I have done no wrong. Then the king was exceedingly glad and commanded that Daniel be taken out of the den. So Daniel was taken up out of the den, and no kind of harm was found on him, because he had trusted in his God. The king gave the command, and those who had accused Daniel were brought and thrown into the den of lions, they, their children, and their wives. Before they reached the bottom of the den, the lions overpowered them and broke all their bones in pieces. Then Darius wrote to all peoples and nations of every language throughout the world, may you have abundant prosperity. I make a decree that in all my royal dominion, people should tremble and fear before the God of Daniel, for he is the living God, enduring forever. His kingdom shall never be destroyed, and his dominion has no end. He delivers and rescues. He works signs and wonders in heaven and on earth, for he has saved Daniel from the power of the lions. So this Daniel prospered during the reign of Darius and the reign of Cyrus the Persian. This is a different kind of.
Said by now that the Medes weren't even probably in existence. So
Right.
what I noticed, it just becomes so blatant at times. When you read the Old Testament, it is not meant in any way to be history or literal. Just like this author was talking about, the dates don't match. It just doesn't work. And so many of the stories just are not, they're, what is it? I can't think of the word now, myths, I guess. But then we go to the New Testament and it becomes very literal. We have firsthand, witness. So it's just such when you're reading the Old Testament and some of these old stories, it just hits so blatantly that this is just stories, not meant to be taken at all literally, but just to convey a truth. And to me, the New Testament is very literal. So anyway.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So this is really paralleling the story that we read in chapter 3 of the furnace, quite a bit. You have the Jews. We see that, Daniel really has no fault at all. In the story with the golden beam or statue or whatever, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego wouldn't kneel, when the band played. You had this group of instruments playing and they were supposed to immediately kneel. They say, we're not doing it, kind of a thing. But in this particular case, Daniel they can't even find fault with Daniel. They have to kind of make up something. And it seems like that the king Darius, who is in charge here in the story, is to be able to have people come to you and just say, you need to create a rule about people bowing down to you, and not praying to any other person, or petitioning any other person but you. And they were trying to get something to trap, not just the king, but Daniel, because they couldn't find any other thing to get Daniel on, and he was going to be put in charge over them. So, politically, who knows what that might have meant, to the power of all of these people. But they actually go to the king and says, we've all agreed that you need to do this. All of your presidents and everyone has agreed to this. Well, that's not true, because Daniel hadn't agreed to it. So it's.
I'm sorry. I was just going to say our first executive orders.
What?
His first
Executive order.
Oh, executive order.
Doesn't this sound like an Old Testament template for the story of Jesus?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
It does.
This particular one, there's a lot of parallels. You have, Go ahead, Harold.
I don't mean to interrupt, it's just there's a delay. I'm sorry I interrupt. I was just also thinking, this Jewish tradition of, I mean, you can't even find a single fault with Daniel. Then you have, nobody lives that way, of course. Then you have King David, who committed genocide and adultery and you name it, murder, and, but he was exalted to the perfect king. It's just, again, in this Old Testament, the tradition is to exalt certain people that may or may not have even existed to this high level for, to convey a truth. It just seems like that part of the Jewish tradition throughout the Old Testament does this.
Mhm. Mm.
I just kept thinking about Jesus as this thing was unfolding. It's like, well, that's what happened, that's what happened, that's what happened, and even including a stone and sealing it.
Right.
And, it's like the template for the new story.
And to think of Pilate, who, Pilate's wife, had said something to the effect of, don't, this is an innocent man. And then Pilate washing his hands, of it. And you have this particular Darius who really wants to save Daniel. He wants to do everything he can because Daniel was his fave person. He was going to have him only, only under him in the whole kingdom. And so, it was, and then they do talk about the stone and then having the king come the morning, after he's in the lion's den and calling out, for Daniel and having Daniel answer him. So there was a lot, there was the conspiracy, of the satraps who was, that's supposed to mean like protectors of the kingdom, that type of thing. They were appointing 3 presidents and Daniel was one of them, but then the king wanted him to be in charge of, even more the whole kingdom. And they kind of compare this throughout the book. They were comparing this with Joseph too. Oh, we've got a jet going over.
Well, and the dream, Pilate's wife had a dream about Jesus. Remember, so you come, it brings dreams into the thing too.
Mhm.
Mm. Mm.
Yeah. Mm.
Hmm.
Okay, but they said that in this particular case, even though Daniel knew that this edict had come out, that he just proceeded to act normally.
Mhm.
That he didn't try, they mentioned civil disobedience in one point, but he always 3 times a day, and all of these people that were against him knew what he did every day. And he'd always open the window facing Jerusalem, to pray. And so they knew that they would be able to catch him because they knew Daniel, even though that the king had made this rule that Daniel would not pay any attention to it. And it's the same thing we saw with his 3 buddies earlier. Doesn't matter what rule you make, I serve God.
Mhm.
And so he was just acting normally and he continued to act normally. And then the king stating, may your God whom you serve continue to rescue you, or constantly will rescue you, is the interpretation.
I'll catch you on Facebook.
It's,
Okay.
facing Jerusalem and praying 3 times a day, does that not bring an idea forward? Who else prays 3 times a day facing Mecca?
Right.
Yeah. And one of the things that it mentioned that there wasn't really, he did say 3 times a day here, but that really there wasn't any standard way that a Jewish person was supposed to pray. They weren't saying you're supposed to pray 3 times a day, you're supposed to do this, that they basically were supposed to pray daily, but they weren't given any ritual about how they did it, when they did it, where they did it, kind of a thing. But
So assuming that was Daniel's choice of,
mhm,
for how to pray.
that's right.
He started a tradition, I guess.
Right. Okay, any other thoughts about this? Because this is the first 6 chapters. These are the stories. Okay, when we move into next week, we come to the revelation, the
Prophecies.
prophecy series of chapters in Daniel. So we've been giving these basic set of stories before we move into the prophecies. So Daniel, the Jewish exile, whose career began in the days of the Chaldean kings, prospers through the reigns of all of the kings of Babylon, the Darius, whoever Darius was, and Cyrus of Persia. And so he outlasts all of these kings as a representative of his worship of God. And so it leads you back to the chapter 1 where it talks about, you know, that that all of these kingdoms will fall to dust and be blown away, but God is everlasting. Okay, it's almost 10 till, so it's time for church.